Hey guys, it's Mr. Schmidt here, and in this video we're going to apply the ideas of consumer and producer surplus to a tax. Okay, so we're going to go ahead and start with the same setup we've had for this unit. So we've got a market here, demand curve, supply curve. Well, I'm going to redraw that supply curve because I didn't really like the way it looked. There we go. It's a bit better. Make sure your supply and demand curves are extending out from the y-axis. And then we're going to say we have some... Actually, we're going to label this QE this time. And we're going to label this PS1, which equals PB1. So QE is the quantity exchanged in the market, which is also the equilibrium quantity. And PS1 is the price the seller receives by selling this product. And at the equilibrium price, it's also PB1, which is the price the buyer has to pay for the product, right? The amount of money the buyer gives to the seller is the same amount the seller receives from the buyer, right? That kind of makes sense. And so we're going to say here the government imposes a tax on the seller. And so the question is, how is that going to affect the market? So the first thing we're going to notice here is that we're going to move supply to the left because now sellers don't want to sell as much because they have to pay a tax to the government. So that's going to take... Guys, I'm really sorry. I'm not drawing my... That's about as good as I'm going to get it. There's supply 1 there. So supply moves to the left. And then what we notice here is really interesting because this intersection point, okay, we're going to carry it down and we're going to say this is QE1. So the new quantity exchanged in the market is now QE1. And we notice it's less than QE because sellers are not supplying as much to the market because they have to pay a tax to the government. Their input costs are now higher. Now, at this intersection point, we have PB2. And you're going to notice here, it is not equal to PS2. So the price the buyer is now paying has increased because they have to pay some of that money in terms of the tax, right? So when you go to the store and you buy something, you have to pay a tax, right? And so PB2 represents a higher price that the buyer has to pay because they now have to pay a tax on the product. It is not the price the seller gets to keep, though, because remember, once that tax goes from the buyer to the seller then has to take it to the government. And so the price the seller actually gets to keep is down here at PS2. So PB2 is the price the buyer gets to keep after the tax, and you might... In your notes, you might go ahead and make a little, you might take each of these terms, QE, QE1, PB2, PB1, and maybe write out to the side what each of those mean. That might be helpful to you. So the price the buyer is now paying is PB2. The price the seller is now receiving is PS2. And so what we're going to do now is go ahead and make each of these areas a letter. And that's going to help us define a few things here. So if you drew it, your letters may be a little bit different than mine, depending on how you made those areas. So if they don't look exactly like mine, that's okay. So we've got A, B, C, D, E, F, G, H. And so the question is where is consumer surplus now, and where was it before? So before the tax, so we'll say CS... Actually, I'll pick a different color here. We'll do that. So CS before the tax, we'll say CS before. So what area was that? Well, that's A, B, C, and D. The area above the price, which was PB1, and below the demand curve. So before the tax, it was A, B, C, and D. After the tax, CS after, is now... we have to use PB2 as our price. So the area above the price, PB2, and below the demand curve. And that's just A. So if you notice here, we have lost, sorry about my C there, we have lost B, C, and D in consumer surplus because the buyers have to pay a higher price. There's going to be some buyers who either don't get to save as much money, remember that's basically what consumer surplus is, or they aren't buying it at all because they can't afford to buy it anymore. They're not willing and able to buy it. And so consumer surplus shrinks considerably. For producer surplus, you might pause the video and see if you can find it. Producer surplus before the tax, area above the supply curve, S, and then below the price, PS1, there you go, would be E, F, G, and H, okay? Area above the supply curve and below the price, right? So E, F, G, and H represent producer surplus before the implementation of the tax, okay? Now, when we go to PS2, right? When we have the PS2 price, that's going to change things, right? Because now it's the area above the supply curve, below the price. And you may be wondering, like, well, which supply curve do we use? We're still using the original supply curve. Because here's the thing. S1 really helps us just visualize the fact that there's a tax, right? It's not really changing how much sellers want to produce so much as how much they're having to pay in terms of the tax. So, PS after is just going to be H. So you notice a considerable loss of producer surplus from EFGH just to H. Next up, what about government revenue? So remember, government revenue, the idea here is that when you pass a tax, the government is trying to collect money. The money the government collects from the tax is government revenue. So what area would that represent? Well, first, the way to think about it is, first of all, how many units are being taxed? And it's this quantity right here, this distance. And then how much money is each of those units being taxed at? Well, it's the difference between PB2, what buyers are paying, minus what sellers are receiving. The difference, because those aren't the same number, that has to be the size of the tax. And so the government revenue is B, C, E, and F. If you're looking for a shortcut, government revenue tends to be a box. So if that helps you, then that's great. And then finally, deadweight loss. Remember, deadweight loss always points to where society wants to be, and it's around the quantity that is no longer being exchanged in the market. And that's the distance between QE and QE1. So deadweight loss, loss of efficiency is D and G. So a AP question could ask you a lot of different things with this. They could ask you, what is consumer surplus before and after? Same thing with producer surplus, government revenue, deadweight loss. They can make you do it with letters. They can make you do it with calculations and numbers. So being able to do both is going to be very helpful, in the practice that I've given you with this should help you see if you get this or not. Remember, and again, just to go back to the S1 curve, the S1 curve, really supply isn't shifting here so much, because, I mean, honestly, you'll see AP questions where they don't even include S1, and you're just moving along the curve. Because really all the tax is doing is changing the price that it's being sold at. And remember, when you change the price, you move along the curve. So a lot of teachers will write it as S plus tax because it's the same supply curve. We're just including the tax. So just don't get confused about that when you're trying to find producer surplus. Still use the original supply curve is my point. So that's all for this video on taxes and efficiency. Until next time, have a great day.